Alrighty, let's get going. Hello, everybody. This is a second video in my series about ancient swords. And today we're going to be talking about two different curved swords from the ancient world. We have in this hand the Egyptian Khopesh, and in this hand the Greek. I say Greek, I hesitated there because you find this sword in Spain as well as in Greece, the Kopis, right? And what is similar between these two swords? If you can't tell, let's see. They're both curved, right? So, oh gosh, it's funny to kind of see it in reverse because I'm seeing myself. But here we have the Egyptian Khopesh. We have a curve starting right about here and going up. And then in our Kopis, we have our curve going right along here and kind of curving back up. And this is actually very important for thinking about how these types of swords were used. These are both Pika replicas. That is a very budget-friendly manufacturer of sword replicas. For both of these, I'm very happy with these swords. They're not perfect by any means, but they are perfect for me. And most importantly, they did not break the bank. So let's dive into it. Let us start with the Egyptian Khopesh. And why are we starting with the Khopesh? That is because this Khopesh has probably some pretty ancient origins. So I've come across two different explanations for the design of this sword. The first is that this sword, sometimes called the sickle sword, developed out of the ancient Egyptian sickle. And if you ever do see a picture of an ancient Egyptian sickle, maybe I can find a way to post one. This is a decent idea here because there's a curve in both of them that is pretty noticeable. The second explanation, before we move on, one important thing as well is that if indeed this sword developed out of a sickle, it really makes it kind of a multi-tool, right? You can harvest your grain with it, and then you can also go off to war when your pharaoh needs you to. There's kind of a multi-purpose, right? I kind of like that answer. I favor it. But the other example that I've heard, or the other explanation, is that and this is what was on the Wikipedia page, this sword developed out of a hatchet or an axe, right? And there is good reason for that, that thesis as well, mainly because when you are striking with this type of a sword, you are using it much like a hatchet. So let's see if I can get kind of an angle on this right here. So here we have, about here is really where the force of the blade is going to be hitting an opponent that you are striking. And when you are striking your opponent, these are actually both dull, so I can hit myself without harming myself. But if you hit your opponent, boom, right there, it's actually acting mechanically much like an axe. Compared to a sword, whose unique advantage typically we think of as being kind of a stabbing weapon in addition to a slashing weapon. We'll get into that again, so keep that in mind. So we have the Egyptian Khopesh, right? However it developed, it could function for multiple purposes, and its mechanism when being used in war is much like an axe. Now, the Egyptian Khopesh fell out of use. It seems, from what I've been able to find, sometime in the late New Kingdom. It may have been used ceremonially after that. But it isn't necessarily contemporaneous, meaning being used at the same time as the Greek Kopis. Now, one thing I want to make note of right now before I make a mistake is that there is speculation. Due to the similarity of the names of these swords, that the design of the Kopis was influenced by the Egyptian Khopesh. Now, one thing that's also important to know about this from an etymological or like a linguistic level is that in the ancient Egyptian language and in their art and iconography, this sword also looks very similar to how they depicted the leg of a cow or bull, which would have been used in like feasts, right? It would have been a big I kind of think of it like a turkey leg, right? That you would get at a modern Renaissance fair, right? It looks like this big old thing that you could take a bite of. Realistically, that's not what it's doing. But there is this similarity there, and there is a linguistic connection in the Egyptian language for Khopesh. I think Khopesh may translate quite literally to like bull's leg. I should look that up. I'll maybe leave a little note in the comments if I'm wrong on that. Anyways, the Kopis and the Khopesh. Now, in my other video, let's put the Khopesh down for a minute. In my other video on ancient swords, we talked about the Greek xiphos, right? Now, the xiphos meant sword, literally. It's by far the most common or even like stereotypical sword to think of when you think of ancient Greece. Let's get this back in the frame here. There we go. But here is another option, right? So this is based off of an actual example that was found and is now resides in the ancient it resides in Athens in their archaeological museum. What is kind of fun to note is that a lot of these handles were made to look like a bird, complete with the beak and everything. Just kind of a cool aesthetic design that is replicated here. But what's most commonly associated with the Kopis in ancient Greece is this kind of forward mechanistic action, right? It's where you are hacking away instead of with a xiphos stabbing. Hopefully that was clear. Basically, a xiphos is meant for stabbing. A kopis is meant for hacking as much as it is for stabbing, right? So our main source about who talks about this type of sword is a ancient Greek soldier whose name is Xenophon. Xenophon was a mercenary soldier. He wrote the book. I actually have it right here, my copy. I haven't read it yet fully. I've only read selections, but it's called the Expedition, or sometimes the Anabasis. It was his own experience as a mercenary soldier. It's something of a funny story. Xenophon traveled all the way to the east to join an army, and the person who hired him died, and him and his 10,000 fellow Greek mercenaries had to trudge their whole way back. And this is kind of how the story unfolds. Xenophon also he's a really important source in terms of like ancient warfare and armor and arms. Another thing he wrote was a handbook on cavalry. Cavalry were exceptionally well-to-do soldiers in the Greek world, right? Greece is kind of a rocky landscape. You can't muster much of a cavalry force, at least in mainland Greece. Sicily and southern Italy seems to have been able to put out more soldiers, more cavalry soldiers. And the book that I recommend if you want to read more about that is an author by the name of Snodgrass, Arms and Armor in the Ancient Greek World. I'll try to not say too many more book titles because we're talking about swords. Anyways, where were we? We were talking about the Kopis and Xenophon. Xenophon, in his handbook on ancient Greek cavalry, says that this sword is particularly good for your cavalry soldier. Why? When you are riding on a horse, right, you need to be careful how you hit your enemy, right? There are some, the most typical one is kind of a slash like this, right? And you got to be careful about your wrist. Before the Civil War and the run up to the Civil War, I know of one sword, a cavalry saber, that was nicknamed the wrist breaker because it was too heavy, it wasn't designed well, and it would break its user's wrists, right? You don't want that. So this sword was designed to be lighter and more agile, right? You can be a little bit more maneuverable with it. You can do more with it. You can stab if you would like, and you can slash, right? And you can see it in the blade's shape. Some other things to know about the Kopis is that it came into, it seems to have been used more in the Hellenistic period, during the time of Alexander the Great. Before that, it seems to be not as commonly found in the Greek arms and army, or at least it's less clear, right? People still kind of want to cling to that ziphos as the stereotypical Greek sword you would find before that. But yeah, I think they're very interesting, when we think about the different personal styles, or preferences that a soldier would have. Now, well, I think that's really all I can say about the Kopis, in and of itself. It's really cool, I'll tell you that. When I've kind of had some fun swinging around with it, it has moved a lot like a saber, and that's the only sword practice that I have. Is a couple of weeks doing a saber, a type of fencing, and both of these swords operate like a saber. And what do I mean by that? You can get these kind of swings in. I'm not left-handed, so I can't do it with this hand, but you can do these kind of maneuvers here using that wrist to really get some moves. Now, if I pull out my Zivos, which I'm not going to do because I'm waving all these swords around, and those ones are sharp, and I got to be careful. But if you were to kind of hold a Zivos in your hand, your movement is somewhat restricted, right? Yes, with a Zivos you can slash, but the way that you hold the sword, it doesn't allow you to make these kind of, I don't know the technical term, but they're curves, they're swooshes in your cut, which I prefer, I enjoy. When you have a Ziphos, right? Maybe I will have to get it out. Let's just, heck, more swords. Let's just get it out. Okay. When you have a Ziphos, right? Again, you have a certain amount of curvature here that you can hack with, but it feels, at least this Ziphos in my hand, it feels like I'm very much limited to this type of a thrusting movement, right? We talked a lot about that in the previous video when we talked about the difference between the Ziphos and the Gladius, the Roman sword. I hope you're watching that first video. It might help. Especially when you think about having a shield in one hand, right? You want to be covered with your shield, and you want to be kind of popping out and stabbing with that. You can't do all these ridiculous, swings. If you have this shield and you're trying to cover yourself, it's too much to manage, right? But what does this offer you, right? Especially with the Roman gladius, I think that it really shows a certain efficiency with your movement, right? You and all of your guys with your shields poking out, stabbing in, stabbing, right? That's what I think it would offer. And so that is why those swords are kind of more thought about when we think of the ancient world, is because groups of soldiers in an army working together would have been able to use them more effectively, wield them more effectively as a group. Okay. Yeah, I think that's all I wanted to say on the matter. It should be noted, just for kind of historical accuracy, that it'd probably be more common to see one of these in bronze than it would be in iron or steel. It's especially steel. No Kopis is in steel, as far as I'm aware. It's just too advanced a technology for when these swords were used. Gosh, I guess I can go on a small tangent about iron in ancient Egypt. One of the most incredible artifacts to come out of King Tutankhamun's tomb is an iron dagger. Now, bronze, in the Bronze Age, obviously, and in ancient Egypt, was more common for weapons. Iron was very uncommon, and this dagger is significant because it is actually iron that came from a meteorite, meaning it didn't come from a mine. They didn't have to dig it up. It had come from outer space, landed on Earth, and it was there for the taking, so to speak, right? And the ancient Egyptians knew how to work with it, and it has this just beautiful pattern to it. But with the Kopis, you could have seen this in iron, in addition to bronze. It's in use during that time period. The bronze, or yeah, I think that's bronze or brass scales. That's a modern fantasy thing. The real life scales aren't that metal. But yeah, the Kopis and the Khopesh. Let me know if you have any questions. Every time I look at how long I can go on a ramble about these, it surprises me. 15 minutes. I should call it there. Probably get to bed. Anyways, swords.